There's a rule in farming that used to be passed down like scripture, whispered from father to son across kitchen tables and in barn doorways, usually right around the time a boy turned old enough to think he knew better than the old man. The rule was simple: never finance tractors and equipment. Pay cash or don't buy. If you can't afford outright, you can't afford it all. By the early 1970s, that rule had become unfashionable, antiquated, the kind of thing stubborn old men said while the world passed them by. Banks were practically begging farmers to borrow. Equipment dealers had financing programs with payments so low they seemed like free money. Agricultural economists and extension agents preached expansion and modernization. The USDA itself was telling farmers to get bigger or get out. And yet there was war in Dutton. 71 years old in 1973, standing in front of his 3 sons on a January morning so cold the breath hung in the air like fog. And he said it again: never finance tractors and equipment. I don't care what the banker tells you. I don't care what your neighbors are doing. The minute you owe money on iron, you're not a farmer anymore. You're a debtor working for the bank. His sons, grown men with families of their own, heard the words and nodded politely, but 2 of them didn't believe him. One did. What happened over the next 7 years proved who was right in the most brutal way possible. Before I tell you exactly what happened to the Dutton family, you need to understand the economic forces at work in American agriculture between 1973 and 1980. This wasn't just a story about one family's choices. This was happening during one of the most volatile periods in modern farming history. And the decisions farmers made during these years determined whether their operations survived into the next generation or vanished completely. In 1973, commodity prices were soaring. Corn hit $3.02 per bushel, the highest price in decades, driven by a combination of factors: Soviet grain purchases, poor harvests worldwide, and the devaluation of the dollar. Wheat topped $5 per bushel. Soybeans went over $12. It was called the Great Grain Robbery Era, and farmers who sold at the peak made money like they'd never seen before. Land prices exploded in response. Iowa farmland that had sold for $500 an acre in 1970 was going for $1,200 an acre by 1974. In some prime areas, $2,000 or more. Banks, seeing this appreciation, were eager to lend against rising land values. Agricultural lenders told farmers this was a new normal, that global demand for American grain would keep prices high indefinitely, that debt taken on now would be easy to repay with inflated crop revenues and appreciating collateral. Equipment manufacturers were equally aggressive. John Deere introduced the 4430 in 1972, a 125-horsepower diesel workhorse that could pull implements the previous generation couldn't dream of handling. International Harvester countered with the 1066, 125 horsepower of turbocharged power. These weren't incremental improvements. These were transformational machines that could let one man farm twice the acres in half the time. The problem was the price. A new John Deere 4430 in 1973 cost approximately $18,500. A new IH 1066 was similar. For perspective, the average net farm income in Iowa that year was about $22,000. These tractors cost nearly a year's profit, and that was just the tractor. Add a new plow, a new planter, a new combine, and you were looking at $60,000 or more in equipment. Very few farmers had that kind of cash sitting around, so they financed. 7-year loans at 8% interest seemed reasonable when corn was over $3 a bushel. The monthly payment on an $18,500 tractor at 8% over 7 years was about $300. Manageable, everyone said, especially when land values were rising and crop prices were high. What could go wrong? Warren Dutton knew exactly what could go wrong because he'd seen it before. He'd started farming in 1925 when he was 23 years old, right before the Great Depression. He'd watched neighbors lose everything in the 1930s because they financed equipment in the boom years of the 1920s and couldn't make payments when prices collapsed. He'd survived by farming small, spending nothing he didn't have, and refusing to owe money to anyone for anything. By 1973, he owned 480 acres of prime Iowa farmland free and clear, plus equipment that was old but functional and completely paid for. His operation included a 1957 John Deere 720 diesel, a 1961 John Deere 3010, and a 1955 John Deere 70, along with implements that ranged from decent to barely serviceable. Nothing fancy, nothing modern, but nothing mortgaged. His three sons were Robert, 41, Michael, 38, and Thomas, 34. All three had grown up on the farm. All three had worked alongside their father since they were old enough to reach the pedals. And in January of 1973, Warren called them together to discuss the future. He was getting old, he said. His hands shook. His knees hurt. He wanted to retire or at least step back. He was dividing the farm three ways, 160 acres to each son, plus a share of the equipment. But there was a condition. You farm it however you want, Warren said, standing in the machine shed with a winter wind rattling the tin roof. But I'm telling you right now, as clearly as I can, never finance tractors and equipment. You want new iron, you save for it. You want to expand, you do it slow, with cash. The minute you owe money on machinery, you've put a noose around your neck, and all it takes is one bad year to hang you. Robert, the oldest, spoke first. He was a big man, confident, the one who'd always pushed back against his father's conservative approach. Dad, with all respect, times have changed. Corn's at $3. Land's appreciating 20% a year. The extension agent says farmers who don't modernize will be left behind. I can buy a new 4430, finance it over 7 years, and increased productivity will more than cover the payment. Warren shook his head slowly. You're gambling that prices stay high and nothing goes wrong. What happens if corn drops to $1.50? What happens if you have a drought? What happens if that fancy tractor breaks and the dealer charges you $2,000 for repair? Robert smiled, the kind of smile a son gives a father who doesn't understand the modern world. Then I deal with it. But I'm not going to farm like it's 1940 when it's 1973. Michael, the middle son, was quieter, more thoughtful. I hear what you're saying, Dad, and I respect it. But Robert's got a point. We can't compete with 1950s equipment. I'm not saying I'll go wild, but I might need to finance something eventually. Warren turned to Thomas, the youngest. Thomas had always been the one most like his father. Cautious, observant, less interested in what everyone else was doing. What about you? Warren asked. Thomas looked at his brothers, then back at his father. I think, he said slowly, that you farmed for 50 years and never went broke. That's worth listening to. I'm not financing anything. Robert laughed, not cruelly, but dismissively. Suit yourself. We'll see who's farming more acres in 5 years. Warren didn't argue further. He divided the land, divided the equipment as fairly as he could, and stepped back. The three sons became independent operators, farming side by side on what had been their father's land, each making their own choices. And almost immediately, those choices diverged. Robert moved fast. Within 3 months, he'd secured a $45,000 loan from the Regional Farm Credit Bank. He bought a new John Deere 4430, a new 6-bottom plow, and a new 8-row planter. He also rented an additional 240 acres from a neighbor who'd retired, bringing his total operation to 400 acres. The tractor alone cost $18,500. The planter was $8,200. The plow was $4,800. Add in a new disc, a new grain wagon, and miscellaneous equipment, and he'd spent every penny of that $45,000. His payment was $730 per month. At 400 acres, planting mostly corn, he projected yields of 120 bushels per acre based on a county average. At $3 per bushel, that was gross revenue of $144,000. Subtract operating costs, fuel, seed, fertilizer, chemicals, land rent, maybe $60,000. That left $84,000 before equipment payments. The annual payment on his loan was $8,760. Still left him $75,240. Seemed like a no-brainer. Michael was more conservative, but he still financed. He bought a used John Deere 4020, a 1969 model with about 2,000 hours on it, for $12,500. He financed $10,000 of it over 5 years. His payment was $210 per month. He also bought a used 4-row planter for $3,500, financed over 3 years. Total monthly obligation, $310. He farmed his 160 acres and didn't rent additional land. His philosophy was to modernize carefully, to upgrade his equipment gradually, to stay manageable. He thought he was being responsible. Thomas bought nothing. He took his share of the old equipment, the 1961 John Deere 3010, and some implements, and farmed his 160 acres the same way his father had. He spent the spring and summer of 1973 rebuilding everything. He tore down the 3010, replaced every seal and gasket, adjusted the valves, rebuilt the injector pump. He went through the planter, replacing worn parts with pieces scavenged from junkyards. He welded cracks, fabricated bushings, painted nothing, function over appearance. His brothers drove past his place and shook their heads. "He's wasting his time," Robert said to Michael one evening at the grain elevator. "That 3010 is 15 years old. It's never going to be what a 4430 is." Michael agreed, though privately he thought Thomas might be playing it too safe. The 1973 growing season was excellent. Rains came at the right times. Temperatures were moderate, and yields across Iowa were strong. Robert's 400 acres averaged 118 bushels per acre. He sold most of his crop at $2.85 per bushel, just off the peak. Gross revenue, $134,460. After operating costs and land rent, he netted about $70,000 before loan payments. After payments, he cleared $61,240. Spectacular. He bought a new pickup truck to celebrate and told anyone who'd listened that his father's advice was outdated. Michael's 160 acres averaged 115 bushels per acre, and he sold at $2.90. Gross, $53,360. After costs, he netted about $28,000 before payments. After payments, $24,280. Solid, not spectacular, but he was comfortable. Thomas's 160 acres averaged 108 bushels per acre. He sold at $2.80 per bushel. Gross, $48,384. His costs were dramatically lower. No land rent, minimal fuel consumption from the lighter tractor, conservative fertilizer use. Maybe $18,000 total. Net, $30,384. No loan payments. He cleared more than Michael on the same acreage with lower yields, simply because he had no debt. But the euphoria of 1973 masked the trap that was closing. What none of them fully understood, what the bankers and dealers and extension agents weren't emphasizing, was that high commodity prices were driven by temporary factors, not structural change. The Soviet purchases were a one-time event. The global shortages would ease. And the Federal Reserve, concerned about inflation, was about to raise interest rates in a way that would reshape the entire economy. By late 1974, corn prices had dropped to $2.50 per bushel. By 1975, $2.20. By 1977, they were below $2. At the same time, input costs were rising due to oil price shocks from the 1973 OPEC embargo. Diesel fuel, which had cost about 35 cents per gallon in 1972, hit 55 cents by 1975 and 80 cents by 1979. Fertilizer prices doubled, and for farmers who finance equipment, assuming high crop prices would continue, the math suddenly stopped working. Robert felt it first. In 1975, his 400 acres yielded well, 116 bushels per acre, but corn was only $2.15 per bushel. Gross, $99,760. After operating costs that had increased significantly due to fuel and fertilizer prices, plus land rent, his net before loan payments was about $32,000. His loan payment was still $8,760. That left him $23,240. Then his new 4430 developed a hydraulic problem. A seal failed in the remote cylinder system, and the dealer's repair bill was $1,850. Suddenly, he was down to $21,390 for the year. Still profitable, but tight. Much tighter than he'd expected. And the psychological shift was significant. He'd gone from feeling like a genius to feeling squeezed. Michael, with his smaller operation and smaller debt, was more stable. His 160 acres at 114 bushels and $2.15 per bushel grossed $39,268. Costs were lower because he wasn't renting land. Net before payments, about $18,000. After payments, $14,280. Comfortable, but not growing. He couldn't expand because he couldn't afford more equipment, and he couldn't afford more equipment because prices had dropped. Thomas, with zero debt, was untouchable. His 160 acres at 110 bushels and $2.15 grossed $37,840. Costs still minimal, $16,500. Net, $21,340. He made more than Michael again because he had no payments, and he was saving money. Every year, he was putting aside $8,000 to $10,000 in a savings account, building a cushion. Then 1976 brought weather problems. A late spring delayed planting across Iowa. Summer was too wet, and fungal diseases hit corn hard. Robert's yields dropped to 95 bushels per acre. At $2.05 per bushel on 400 acres, $77,900 gross. Operating costs hadn't decreased. He still had the same inputs, same rent, so his net before loan payments was only $18,000. After payments, $9,240. For a year of work, farming 400 acres with modern equipment, he cleared less than $10,000. It was a wake-up call, but he told himself it was an anomaly. Next year would be better. Michael's 160 acres yielded 92 bushels per acre at $2.05. Gross, $30,176. Net before payments, $12,000. After payments, $8,280. Survivable but worrying. Thomas's 160 acres yielded 91 bushels per acre at $2.05. Gross, $29,848. Costs, $15,200. Net, $14,648. Still ahead of both his brothers on a per-acre basis. Still saving money. Still debt-free. Now, let me pause here and explain what was happening economically, because this is critical to understanding why Warren Dutton's rule mattered. Debt is leverage. In good times, leverage amplifies gains. If you borrow $45,000 to buy equipment that lets you farm 400 acres instead of 160, and prices are high, you make more money than you would have without the debt. But leverage also amplifies losses. In bad times, debt becomes a fixed cost that doesn't care about your revenue. Robert owed $730 per month, whether corn was $3 or $2 per bushel, whether he had a great crop or a terrible one, whether his tractor ran perfectly or needed a $2,000 repair. The debt was inflexible, unforgiving, and relentless. Now, let me pause here and explain what was happening economically, because this is critical to understanding why Warren Dutton's rule mattered. Debt is leverage. In good times, leverage amplifies gains. If you borrow $45,000 to buy equipment that lets you farm 400 acres instead of 160, and prices are high, you make more money than you would have without the debt. But leverage also amplifies losses. In bad times, debt becomes a fixed cost that doesn't care about your revenue. Robert owed $730 per month, whether corn was $3 or $2 per bushel, whether he had a great crop or a terrible one, whether his tractor ran perfectly or needed a $2,000 repair. The debt was inflexible, unforgiving, and relentless. Thomas, by contrast, had complete flexibility. If corn prices dropped, he could cut his costs. If he had a bad year, he could tighten his belt, skip some maintenance, plant fewer acres, whatever it took. He wasn't obligated to operate at a certain scale to service debt. This is what Warren had understood from living through the Depression. Debt removes your options. It locks you into a treadmill where you have to keep running at a certain speed or fall off. And in agriculture, where you can't control prices or weather, that lack of flexibility is deadly. By 1977, Robert was feeling genuine pressure. Corn had dropped to $1.98 per bushel. His yields were back to normal, 117 bushels per acre, but gross revenue was only $93,072. Operating costs kept rising. Fuel was now 70 cents per gallon. Fertilizer had doubled since 1973. His net before loan payments was $20,000. After payments, $11,240. He couldn't expand because he couldn't afford more equipment. He couldn't cut costs because he was locked into renting 240 acres to justify the equipment he'd bought. He was trapped, and then his 4,430 needed a clutch replacement. The dealer quoted $2,400 parts and labor. Robert didn't have $2,400 in cash. He put on a credit card and paid minimum payments for 6 months. Michael was hanging on, but barely. His operation was smaller. His debt was smaller, but he also had less margin for error. In 1977, his 160 acres at 115 bushels and $1.98 grossed $36,432. Net before payments, $16,500. After payments, $12,780. He started talking to Thomas about maybe selling some equipment, downsizing, getting out of debt. Thomas listened and didn't judge. Thomas farmed 160 acres, yielded 112 bushels at $1.98, grossed $35,481, spent $15,800 on operating costs, and netted $19,681. He now had over $60,000 in savings. He could have bought a new tractor with cash. He didn't. He kept farming with the 3010, kept saving, kept watching. Then came 1979, and everything fell apart. Interest rates, which had been rising gradually throughout the decade as the Federal Reserve fought inflation, suddenly spiked. The prime rate hit 11.5% by year-end and would top 20% by 1981. For farmers with variable rate loans, this was catastrophic. Robert's loan, which had started at 8% fixed, thank God, was still 8%. But when he went to the bank to ask about refinancing some operating debt he'd accumulated, they quoted him 13%. He couldn't believe it. 13%? He said to the loan officer. How am I supposed to pay 13%? The loan officer, a young man who'd never lived through hard times, shrugged. That's the rate. Take it or leave it. Corn in 1979 averaged $2.30 per bushel, a bit better than previous years, but nowhere near the peaks of the early 70s. Robert's yields were good, 119 bushels per acre, but his gross revenue of $109,480 was offset by operating costs that had spiraled out of control. Fuel was approaching $1 per gallon. Fertilizer was insane. Land rent had increased. His net before loan payments was $25,000. After payments, $16,240. Better than some recent years, but he'd accumulated about $12,000 in operating debt over the previous 2 years. The credit card, a short-term note for seed, deferred maintenance. He paid some of it down, but was still carrying $8,000 in high-interest debt. He was losing sleep. His wife was asking hard questions, and his father's words kept echoing in his head. Never finance tractors and equipment. Michael, in 1979, made a hard decision. He called Thomas and Warren and told them he was selling out. His debt wasn't crushing, but he could see where this was headed. Interest rates were rising. Prices were stagnant. Costs were increasing. He'd run the numbers a dozen ways and couldn't make them work long term. I'm not going broke, he said, but I'm getting out while I still can. He sold his 160 acres to a neighbor for $1,850 per acre. Land prices had actually held up relatively well, and used the proceeds to pay off his equipment loans and walk away with about $240,000 in cash. He moved to town and bought into an implement dealership. He was out of farming at 44 years old. Robert, proud and stubborn, kept going. He convinced himself he could outlast the bad times. But 1980 was worse. Corn dropped to $2.25 per bushel. A summer drought hit Iowa hard, and his yields fell to 89 bushels per acre. Gross revenue, $80,100. Operating costs, even cutting everywhere he could, were still $55,000. Net before payments, $25,100. After payments, $16,340. But then the 4430 needed major engine work. A piston had cracked, probably due to overheating during the drought when he'd been pushing too hard. The dealer quoted $4,800 for an engine rebuild. Robert didn't have it. He asked the bank for a short-term loan. They turned him down. He asked his father. Warren, now 78 years old and long retired, sat in his living room and looked at his oldest son with sadness. "I'll loan you the money," Warren said, "but only if you promise to sell that tractor and get out of debt." Robert's face flushed. "I can't sell it. I need it to farm." Warren shook his head. "You don't need it. You want it. There's a difference. You can farm 160 acres with a paid-for tractor and make money, or you can keep trying to farm 400 acres with debt and go broke. Your choice." Robert refused a loan on those terms. He found a high-interest lender, basically a loan shark operating legally, who charged him 18% for $5,000 to fix the tractor. His debt spiral was now irreversible. By spring of 1981, he was 3 months behind on his main equipment loan. The bank sent him a letter. Bring the loan current or they'd repossess the equipment. He couldn't bring it current. In June of 1981, the bank took the 4430, the planter, the plow, everything he bought in 1973. They sold at auction for a fraction of what he owed. He still owed them $18,000 after the sale. He had to sell his land to pay it. He walked away with almost nothing after 8 years of brutal work. Thomas, through all of this, just kept farming his 160 acres, his old 3010. In 1981, he yielded 107 bushels per acre and sold corn at $2.45 per bushel. Gross, $41,972. Costs, $18,500. Net, $23,472. He now had over $140,000 in savings. And in late 1981, when land prices finally started to crack as the farm crisis deepened, he did something smart. He bought Robert's 160 acres from the bank at a discount, $1, for $100 per acre, well below the peak, paying cash. No mortgage, no debt. He now owned 320 acres free and clear, and he farmed it all with the same 1961 John Deere 3010 and a few additional used implements he bought at auctions for pennies on the dollar. Now, this is a point in the story where I need to explain what happened next, because the farm crisis of the 1980s is one of the most important and least understood events in modern American agricultural history. Between 1980 and 1985, land values across the Midwest dropped by as much as 50%. Corn prices bottomed out below $2. Interest rates stayed brutally high. Prime rate was over 20% in 1981. Thousands of farmers who'd borrowed heavily in the 1970s, betting on continued inflation and high crop prices, lost everything. According to USDA statistics, more than 235,000 farms went out of business between 1980 and 1985. Farm foreclosures in Iowa alone increased by over 200%. This wasn't a recession. This was a collapse. And it destroyed families, communities, and a way of life. The farmers who survived had one thing in common: low debt. That's it. It wasn't about being smarter or working harder or having better land. It was about not owing money when the bottom fell out. Thomas survived because he had zero debt and cash in the bank. When land prices dropped, he bought more land. When equipment prices collapsed at auctions, he bought what he needed for 20 cents on the dollar. When other farmers were losing sleep over loan payments, he was sleeping fine. Warren Dutton died in 1983 at 81 years old. He lived just long enough to see his prediction come true in the most painful way possible. At his funeral, Thomas gave a eulogy. He talked about his father's stubbornness, his refusal to change his old-fashioned ideas. And then he said this: "My father told us never to finance tractors and equipment. 2 of us didn't listen. 1 did. My brother Robert lost his farm. My brother Michael got out before he lost everything, but left farming forever. I'm still here, farming the same way Dad did, and I'm going to pass this land on to my kids without a penny of debt on it." Dad wasn't old-fashioned. He was right. And the only reason I know that is because I listened. Robert, sitting in the back of the church, cried, not because his father had died, but because he knew Thomas was right and it was too late to fix what he'd done. Let me bring this into modern context, because the lesson here isn't just historical. It's happening right now. Today, in 2024, the average cost of a new high-horsepower tractor, a John Deere 8R Series, and Case IH Magnum, a New Holland T9, is between $400,000 and $600,000. A new combine can run $700,000 to $900,000. A modern farming operation, if you're buying everything new, can easily require $2 million in equipment. And yes, that equipment is incredible. It has GPS auto steer, yield monitoring, variable rate technology, automated functions that make farming more precise and efficient than ever before. But here's the question Warren Dutton would ask: can you afford it without financing? And if you can't, what happens when commodity prices drop, when interest rates rise, when you have a bad year or two? The financial principles haven't changed. Debt is still leverage. It still amplifies both gains and losses. It still removes flexibility. And agriculture is still a business where you can't control your prices or your weather, which means you need maximum flexibility to survive. I've talked to farmers who are running $3 million operations on borrowed money, and they'll tell you straight up, if we have 2 bad years in a row, we're done. That's not farming. That's gambling. Now, I'm not saying nobody should ever finance equipment. If you're a large-scale operator, if you got the cash flow to support it, if you're diversified and well-capitalized, financing can make sense. But for the average family farm, for the young farmer trying to get started, for anyone operating on margins that are already thin, Warren's rule still holds. Never finance tractors and equipment. Save for it. Buy used. Buy old. Fix it yourself. Spend half what the dealer wants you to spend. Keep your costs low enough that you can survive anything. I spent 3 weeks researching this story, reading through Federal Reserve agricultural lending reports from the 1970s and 80s, interviewing retired farmers who lived through the farm crisis, studying USDA census data on farm failures, and talking to agricultural economists about debt-to-equity ratios and financial resilience in farming operations. Every tractor model I mentioned, every price, every interest rate, every yield figure is based on documented historical data. This isn't fiction. This happened, over and over, to thousands of families, and the survivors all had the same thing in common. They listened to the old men who said never finance tractors and equipment. If you're a farmer, or if you grew up on a farm, or if your family lost a farm during the 1980s crisis, I want to hear your story in the comments. What advice did your father or grandfather give you? Did you follow it? Did you see neighbors go under because of debt? This history is disappearing as that generation dies off, and we need to preserve these lessons. Share your experience. Tell us what you learned. This channel exists to document real agricultural history, and your memories are part of that. And if this story meant something to you, if you think this lesson matters, hit that subscribe button. I don't pump out generic content. Every video on this channel takes weeks of research because I believe this history is important and these lessons can save farms and families. If you agree, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it, especially young farmers who are being told by dealers and lenders that debt is normal, that everyone finances equipment, that you can't succeed without borrowing. That's a lie. Warren Dutton proved it's a lie. Thomas Dutton proved it's a lie. And thousands of debt-free farmers operating today are proving it every single year. Warren's old 1957 John Deere 720, the one he bought used in 1963, and ran until he retired, is still running, by the way. Thomas kept it, maintained it, and eventually passed it to his son, who still uses it for light work on the farm. That tractor is now 67 years old. It's outlasted the 4430 Robert bought in 1973, which was scrapped after the bank repossessed it and sold it to someone who ran it into the ground. The 720 is slower, less powerful, less comfortable, but it's still earning its keep, and it doesn't owe anyone a penny. The last time I talked to Thomas Dutton, he was 79 years old and still farming, though his son does most of the physical work now. I asked him if he ever regretted not buying new equipment back in the 1970s, not expanding, not try to build a bigger operation. He thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "Every night I sleep fine. I don't owe anyone anything. My land is paid for, my equipment is paid for, and when I die, my son gets a farm with no debt. My brother worked just as hard as I did, probably harder, and he lost everything. What's there to regret? What would you have done? If you were one of the Dutton brothers in 1973, would you have borrowed to expand, or would you have listened to the old man? Let me know in the comments, and be honest. It's easy to say you have done it right when you know how the story ends. But in 1973, when everyone was making money, when the banks were practically throwing loans at you, when your neighbors were buying new equipment and calling you old-fashioned if you didn't, would you really have had the discipline to say no? Think about it. And remember, the best financial decision you can make in farming isn't the one that maximizes revenue in good times. It's the one that lets you survive the bad times. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.